Welcome to the third episode of the TAQS.IM Middle Eastern Music Podcast. Today we're fortunate enough to present you an interview that AK did with the oud player John Berberian at his home in February of 2019. But before we get to the interview, we'd appreciate if you help spread the word about the podcast by writing a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you access the podcast. We read all the reviews and it really helps get the word out. So now, without further ado, here's the interview.
Welcome to our TAQS.IM podcast. This is Andrew Kazarian. I have the honor of being here with oud legend John Berberian. Today we're going to be learning a little bit about John's take on the oud and his background as a musician, performing, recording, and kind of the history of everything he's done. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to be here and to hopefully help you in this project.
Excellent, excellent. So, John, if you could maybe introduce yourself to some of our listeners. I'm sure some of them may have heard of your music and your contribution to Middle Eastern artistry, but I'd love for you to kind of just give a little brief background of yourself and kind of educate our listeners a little bit.
Okay, I don't know quite where to start, but nevertheless, I probably had about over 50 years of music experience, oud playing experience. It's been the love of my life for this many years. I did work, you might say, a decent daytime job for many of those years, and oud playing was a spice to the life that I lived in. However, I didn't really want to make music a full-time venture because I felt like I wanted to keep it away from being a job, so to speak. There's time for a job and there's time for pleasure, and music was always that pleasure end of my life, and oud was that vehicle. So I went to school. I went to Columbia University, and there studied whatever I needed to go into business. And I worked as purchasing director, manager, you call it, what you will, buyer, for various companies. And when I finally moved out of New York, New Jersey area to Massachusetts, I pretty much retired from the daytime work and just concentrated on my music. And that's what I am doing now in my retirement years. And I have some students that come for lessons, and I'm very happy to pass on whatever I have learned to them.
And John, you're being modest. I mean, you have a huge discography of super high quality professional recordings, just masterful music of the oud. Could you go into a little bit of that? I think that would be something interesting for people to hear about.
Well, I was surprised when at a young age, I think it was 21 years of age, some producers from a major record label came to where I was working. It was an Armenian restaurant called the Golden Horn in New York City. And they came there, and it sort of mushroomed from that point on. Mainstream Records had produced 2 of my previous albums, and then we went on to record for Verve Forecast and RCA and MGM. And little by little, I found that, gee, you could make a decent living out of this kind of thing and really enjoy it at the same time. But nevertheless, it started back there in the early 60s for me. It mushroomed into something of a different nature, and we recorded an album called Middle Eastern Rock on Verve Forecast label. And that took us into a different vein, and that was
kind of like a landmark recording for the time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And I think if you were to listen to that today, in terms of today's taste in rock or jazz music, I think you'd find something very, very current, even view the fact that was recorded in the 60s.
And there was a scene, right? There was a burgeoning, thriving Middle Eastern music scene in live music.
Yes.
And I feel like the timeliness of that, when you were kind of coming into your own as a musician and an artist yourself, there was a coincidence, a synergy there that I think was a really big part of all this.
Yeah.
And maybe could you speak about that, the scene with all the live shows, the belly dancers, the programs? I mean, from what I would hear, there would be 6 or 7 nights a week. Multiple restaurants would have packed houses with live bands. I mean, that sounds so captivating and interesting.
Yeah. New York city was really a melting pot for music and for cultures. Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Turkish, all mixed, sometimes within one given restaurant club venue. Musicians, it was like a United Nations on stage sometimes with the various types of music being offered.
And you would play with artists from so many different backgrounds.
That's right.
You'd have like a Greek clarinet player, an Arab drummer, a Turkish violinist, an Armenian oud player. I mean, it was just such a mix, right?
Absolutely. And this was an area in New York called Greektown, but don't judge it by the name. It wasn't only Greek music that was played, is what I'm trying to say. It was a mixture of music, and the Greek, for the most part, were the owners of these clubs, but focused on various music. And these were the older generation, if you will, the first comers to America that played in these clubs. I, as a young person, would go every now and then, and they would ask me to come up and play. And I felt like they were proud of me, especially the Armenian older men oud players would say, "Johnny, come on up and do something." And it gave them a chance to sit back and say, "Wow, let's show off this Armenian kid to the rest of the audience that's over here." And they were very happy about that. Then there was another area of New York, Greenwich Village. It was a different scene. It was an after-hour scene. These were more like coffee houses. Typical place, one very well known, was called the Café Finjan. And it was Israeli. Talk about a melting pot. We had Palestinian Arabs and Israeli from Israel presenting their music. We had a Moroccan doumbé player by the name of Ali Hafid. And it was just wonderful to see this togetherness. And I wish the Middle East would take an example today of what it was like in that coffee house.
That's a great point. How music brought everyone together.
Yeah.
People could set aside their differences. No, that's a really great point.
Yeah.
John, given your background with the oud and your experience playing this instrument, I'd love for you to share some of your impressions of what the oud means to you. From what I know, your father was involved with the oud. It's something you grew up seeing in your world. You were immersed in it. And how that impacted your playing and your artistry, the style of music that you cultivated.
Well, yes, my father played the oud. I learned much from him. He was an immigrant from an Armenian village in Turkey, as my mother was as well. But my father had a talent for the oud and also sang very well. Much of what he did sing happened to have been Turkish songs, as was the case with many of the newcomers to the New York area and major cities in the country. Those that left villages in Turkey obviously were fluent in the Turkish language. They had to be, so to speak. Nevertheless, this was an inspiration for me, and my father tried to steer me in favor of the violin because he felt that was more of a viable instrument here in America. And asked that, I consider that and take violin lessons. So I did. For 5 years, I studied violin with a teacher, and I played in a couple of symphony orchestras. Although amateur as they may be, that was my focus at the time. But I couldn't get my hands off or my heart away from the oud, if you will. And I eventually came back and made that my instrument of choice.
As you explained that about where the oud was something that you saw all the time, your father, obviously a strong influence. So as you were maturing into adulthood, into becoming an artist in your own right, what was your approach? What was your philosophy as an oud player, learning what you had seen growing up and turning that into, as I'm sitting here with you, all of these records that I see on the wall? You clearly kind of charted a course for yourself artistically. Maybe if you could speak to that, I think that would be super interesting.
Because of my violin training, it gave me a classical experience. It not only helped me to work with a fretless instrument, as the violin is, and as the oud happens to be, but it also sort of took me into what is a Western way of thinking. So we had to play, you might say, legit classical music on the violin. When I first went for my violin instruction, I went there playing an Armenian song with a lot of quarter tones, and my violin instructor said, "You got to forget this. You can't play like that and be in the symphony orchestra someday."
They're not into the microtones.
Yeah. That was a different school of thought. And
when you were learning the instrument, coming into your own, when you were, okay, I'm going to have some structure. I'm going to do records. I'm going to perform. I see all these records, all this memorabilia, all these instruments. So clearly it became an organized professional endeavor in many ways.
Yes.
So as you were learning, you did the violin, you did the oud. So how did it lead to all these records and these performances? I think that's such a cool thing.
Yeah. One record kind of led into another one and another one. I think that...
Like, how did you start recording? How did you start asking musicians to come play with you on these recordings and these ensembles?
Okay. Well...
Because it seemed like you had a logistical function, too.
Yeah.
You're just like, okay, guys, we're doing this recording. I'm organizing everything.
Yeah. Okay. There was a time back in the 60s when one focus was on Indian music, namely Ravi Shankar and the Sitar. There were recording companies that recorded him. They wanted, it sort of was something unusual for its day. Many artists performed with Ravi Shankar as a result during those times. The recording company that I dealt with looked at the oud, the instrument that I was playing, in a way that they could compare it with the sitar, and thought that maybe I could do what Ravi Shankar did with the sitar and do it on the oud. And so this was their focus. When they printed my first album covers, they focused on the oud rather than on me, and thinking that, well, okay, if we can push the instrument, then maybe this person would be known for it.
So the marketing
yes.
philosophy and strategy behind the oud. See, this is the interesting stuff about how the music industry was viewing the instrument and the rise of it in that time period.
Yes,
to try and promote it and maybe get other oud players, and they probably were looking at it financially, how to promote this scene.
Yeah. As a youngster in music, and especially in recording albums like this, didn't care. I wanted to just make some music, and it sounded like it was a tremendous opening for me. And sort of, that's how it started. There was distribution that was done worldwide, as a matter of fact. These albums were sent out. I wish the rock album had the same kind of distribution or management push, because the company sold hands about a year after that rock album of mine was released, and new management was no longer interested in really pushing the old stuff, even though it was relatively new for the company, yet they were interested in their own productions. Whoever had that album, and if it's still out there, and CDs were made later by other companies to reproduce that, so it had some travel, if you will. There are some things I'm probably leaving out.
So here's a question. In terms of your playing, you're an Armenian American, yet you had such a diverse background performing in that music scene that you described, and also with so many different musicians from different cultural backgrounds. So how would you define the different types of oud styles? The Arabs, of course, there's so many Arab countries. They have their style of playing. There's a Turkish style generically. And of course, they have their subparts as well regionally. There's the Armenian style, the Greek style. Maybe share some of your thoughts and impressions of what you hear and what each one has and what you like or what you feel is so great about the Armenian American oud player.
Mm-hmm. One thing I tried to do was to, and it's hard, not to be a jack of all trades, but a master of all trades. I loved Armenian music, and I tried to reproduce it as authentically as I can, being an American-born Armenian. But when I heard Turkish music, I felt the same way about that. I wanted to reproduce it as they would. I think I mentioned to you once that if I was presented in front of a bunch of judges from a particular country, and judges of music and the oud, let's be more specific, I wanted to be approved by them 100% in each of those cultural areas. Not to be thought of as, well, he plays certain things well, but he's not familiar with the foundations of our music. Yeah. I wanted really to get down to nitty-gritty and build up from something solid.
Yes.
So they could not find something missing. I love the idea of being versatile, not being branded as one or the other, that I could play in any venue, and I studied music in each of these cultures, Arabic included. I loved Arabic music, especially Arabic classical music. I studied that music wholeheartedly, and you know, if I had a choice, well, I was going to say if I had a choice to grade them 1, 2, and 3, it's hard. It's really hard. There's good in every music, and even to create a new music, as we would use the concept of fusion and bring in rock elements within an Armenian song or a Arabic song or a Turkish song. So that's another nuance that I wanted to experiment with. So that's about it.
And so how would you describe, of course, when people think of stringed instruments that are plucked, usually people think about a guitar. Given the pervasiveness of the guitar, and also how the oud is coming more into the mainstream, what are your thoughts on the oud compared to a guitar? What are the differences? How do you feel they work together? Things of that nature.
Well, I'm a lover of oud and guitar combination, to say the least. Oud is an acoustic instrument for the most part. This is how it was built. This is where its origins were. It wasn't meant to be electrified. However, at least not the original. Let's say the grandfather to the guitar, which the oud is considered today, goes hand in hand, grandson and grandfather, as far as music is concerned. And it's a natural outgrowth, I think, of the oud. The guitar lends itself. That middle instrument, by the way, is a lute, and that is also a part of that, let's say, the lute family of instruments.
Like on your records, did you incorporate guitar with oud?
Yes. Yes, I did. Going back in time, there was a music friend of mine by the name of Eddie Brandon, who was really a very fine guitarist, and we played together for a while, and I recorded a piece called a Persian-Armenian medley on one of my albums, and it was a wonderful little give and take of oud and guitar, and I think they really work well together. Two ouds also work very well together. I think oud and a keyboard nowadays also makes a lot of sense, especially with all the synthesized sounds that you can get from a keyboard. But there's a sort of classiness, a simpleness, a meaningful part of hearing an oud and guitar together. It's just great. I played violin for a while, and I still do, but like any instrument, you have to keep after it, otherwise you start to become rusty.
What encouragement or thoughts would you offer to someone who's just starting to play the oud? Any advice or some guidance you might offer them?
I think my best advice would be to listen. First of all, listen to as much of the type of music you love to play on the oud. Music is constantly changing. The music that my father enjoyed was one type of music. we sort of evolve into our own world. We think of an Armenian in America, it presents a different slant on music as compared with an Armenian in an Arab country or a Turkish village. You take on the character of the country you live in and the music that's played in that country. It's unavoidable. My parents brought the music to this country that they were used to. Well, if they were born and brought up in an Arab country, their slant on music and maybe my take on it as a result of being born from them is going to be different as well.
Yeah. Of course. Well, I want to thank you, John. TAQS.IM is very excited to have this session with you. We want to wish you the best of luck with all your music endeavors.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It's very nice to be here, and I wish you well on this project and many more interviews. Maybe we can do this again.
Yes,
sometime.
yes. We're looking forward to having yourself and others be a part of the community with TAQS.IM.
I'm looking forward to the other interviews as well, to hearing those. Thank you.
Excellent.
Be well.
All right, take care.
Thank you again for listening to the podcast. You can check us out online at TAQS.IM or search for us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Until next time.